Today we're going to talk about using custom user settings on your Nikon Z series camera for landscape photography. Have you ever wondered what the U1, U2, and in some cases U3 options were on the mode dial of your Nikon camera? It's actually a really cool way to allow you to customize the starting point for your landscape photography settings with the turn of a dial. So why would you want to customize those settings, and why is that option there? Well, think about it. Have you ever been out there, you're photographing, let's say a waterfall. We all know on this channel that I love waterfalls. And I'm out there, I've got my tripod set up, got a long exposure. Since I'm on the tripod, I've got a really low ISO, photograph my waterfall, and everything's good. And now, I'm just gonna take a little break. There's something cool catching my eye over here. I'm just gonna handhold the shot because I wanna leave my tripod here. So I pick up my camera, take it. Well, now I need to switch things around because I'm hand holding my camera. I'm probably gonna need a little higher ISO, a little faster shutter speed because I'm not on the tripod anymore. So I have to hop in there, change those settings, remember to change them all. Things like vibration reduction, I'm probably gonna turn off exposure delay and to go photograph that scene. And inevitably, I'm gonna forget to do something. For example, the vibration reduction. I probably had it off sitting on the tripod, but when I pick it up and handhold, I'd like to have that so maybe I can have a slightly lower ISO. Exposure delay. I can't count how many times I've taken my camera off the tripod, gone to do handheld photography, pressed the shutter, wondered why is it not going, then hear the click and go, exposure delay, I left it on. So this is where the U1, U2, and U3 custom settings on the mode dial can come in. I can preset my starting points for what kind of photography I'm going to do. So for example, I tend to shoot off of a tripod when I'm doing landscape photography. So I can set up a set of settings that are catered towards that type of photography. Lower ISO, longer shutter speeds, turn my vibration reduction off, turn my exposure delay on or self-timer on, and have those all set up. And then when I decide to take my camera off, when I go handhold, I want different settings. And instead of having to go in and make those changes completely manually every time, I can configure my U1, U2, or U3 options on my mode dial to get me to a starting point. So for example, I could set my U1 to very close to what I would typically photograph when I'm photographing off of a tripod. So I sit down, put it in U1, those are my tripod settings, and yes, I'm gonna have to make some adjustments, speed the shutter speed up or slow it down or something like that, depending on what kind of scene I'm photographing, but it can get me to a good starting point. And even more importantly, it can help me remember those settings I always forget. For example, I've been handheld shooting, I probably had vibration reduction on. I bring the camera over, set it on top of the tripod, and I really want vibration reduction off just to make sure the camera's not trying to hunt around or do anything strange like that while it's on the tripod. Can't count how many times I've forgotten to turn that off or on, depending on which way I'm going. So with the custom user settings, I can configure those to get me into those starting points, so I won't forget those little things. Still super easy to change your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO if you need to, but at least puts me in a reasonable starting point, and some of those extra settings are already set for me and I won't have to worry about forgetting them. So that lets me go easily from shooting on a tripod, taking the camera off the tripod, switching my user dial to U2 or U3 or whatever I have it configured to, do my handheld shooting, and then if I want to go back to the tripod, just move back, set my camera back, and it just makes remembering those things so much easier. And not only can those custom user settings handle the settings within the camera, you can also change which your custom function buttons do too if you're advanced. Now, I don't do that. I feel like most of my custom functions, I'd rather just have it be muscle memory and not muscle memory and thinking, am I in U1, U2, U3? So I don't tend to do that, but for those that really like to tweak and configure the camera just super optimally, that is an option as well, that you can even switch how your custom buttons work depending on which user setting you're in. So today we're going to take a look at how to make those settings, get you your starting point, how to save those into either the U1 or U2 slot, or on some cameras a U3 slot, and then how switching back and forth between those works, and some of the nuances associated with that. Now, we're not going to dive into the specifics of my whole camera setup. I will talk a little bit about why I'm changing certain things on here between setting to setting, but it's a very personalized thing. These are sort of the ways I shoot. You probably shoot a little differently, or maybe shoot different scenes more often or less often, and maybe you could bounce between landscape photography and portrait photography and you want to do some setting changes there. So in a future video, I will dive into how I completely set up my Nikon Z7 II camera and 6 II camera for landscape photography, but today we're just going to sort of cover some of the high-level custom settings I do and how to save those settings to one of the user modes. So with that, let's dive into setting up one of the custom user settings. Okay, I'm going to do this setup on the back of a Nikon Z7 II, but it'll be very similar across the Nikon Z series line, and it'll even be applicable to DSLRs, maybe some subtle variations between the menus, and I believe the Z50 only has a U1 and a U2 on the mode dial and not a U3, but that's no big deal. It's just you can only save 2 settings as opposed to 3 on some of the other cameras. So let's dive in here. What I am currently in manual mode, And I've sort of messed up my manual mode settings to be something I wouldn't typically have. I'm going to go ahead and configure these settings the way I would for when I'm doing tripod photography. That's a way I photograph frequently, is off of a tripod. So we're going to go in here and start configuring this. So first I'm going to set my aperture down to around f11. Change my shutter speed down to about 1/25 or so. And then change my ISO down to ISO 64. So that gets my exposure triangle all set. This is a good starting point for when I'm shooting off of a tripod. Will some of these settings need changed? Of course, but it gets me into a starting point and it gets my exposure triangle in a place that I can work from pretty easily. Maybe I'll change the aperture up, maybe I'll speed the shutter up, slow it down, or maybe even I'll bump that ISO up a bit, but it gets me a good starting point. Now I also have several frequently used settings in my I menu that I'm going to go ahead and tweak so that when I'm on a tripod, I already have those set and I can switch back and forth. So let's dive into that menu. The first one is exposure delay. I am going to set that to 2 seconds. That's typically what I do when I'm on a tripod. Bounce over here to release mode, which is set to single frame, which is just how I like it. No problems there. Over here, I've got my autofocus area mode. Right now, it's set to people's faces. That's not going to work great in landscape photography. So when I'm doing landscape of a tripod, I want single point AF. So I set that. White balance, I already have it set here, but I sort of have it configured to 5600K. I just like that. It's nice base. I always know where I'm working from. So I've got that set in there. And vibration reduction, this is one I always forget when I'm moving from tripod to handheld back and forth. So we're going to turn vibration reduction off. And now that way, when I'm in this mode and put it in, have the saved settings, it'll have vibration reduction off because I'm going to be shooting on a tripod. And finally, set my from autofocus mode from continuous autofocus to single AF. And in landscape photography, that should work. The mountains aren't really moving, so I'm good there. So those are my base settings. These are just starting points. These are things that could change, but it's super handy to be able to choose this and go. So what I want to do now is I need to save this. Right now I've just configured it. Camera has this. Now I want to save it to either a U1, U2, or U3 slot. So I hit menu and we're going to save those settings I just configured to one of my slots. So we're going to arrow down to the wrench, which is the setup menu on the Nikon. We're going to go over and down to save user setting. So we click that and I can save it to U1, U2, or U3. I like to save it to U3 because of how things are on the dial. That actually puts it closer to what I'm typically at. So it's a sort of a more efficient turn for me. So we're going to save it to U3, save settings. And now my U3 on the camera are what I want it to be. So we can back out of these menus. So that's how you do it. You configure your camera to the settings you want. You come in to save user settings, and then you choose U1, U2, or U3 and save those settings to there. Okay, so we've saved our settings. I'm still in manual mode from when I configured it. So let's mess with these settings real quick. Let's go ahead and let's set this aperture back up. Let's set the shutter speed up. Let's set the ISO up. And let's go ahead and just so we can demonstrate it, let's go ahead and set the exposure delay back to 0 to off. So what I've done, I'm manual mode on the mode dial, and I've just messed up my setting. But we saved them to U3, so now I'm going to go up to the dial, turn it to U3, and there you go. On the back of the display, you can see it says MU3, my starting point, and it has my starting settings again. 1/125th of a second, F11, ISO 64, delay of 2 seconds, and all my settings are back. Switch back to manual, and it goes back to show the settings I messed up, but if I need to change things back, come back to here, and I can change the settings. So you can repeat that and go through and configure U2 and U3. For my U2, I tend to go handheld. So I kick the ISO up a little bit more. I tend to shoot in aperture priority a lot of times when I'm doing handheld. I turn vibration reduction on. I turn exposure delay off. And now when I want to go from the tripod to shooting handheld, I can change from U3. I would usually set that one to U2 for the handheld mode and get my base settings. Again, it's just the start. Maybe I need a little higher ISO, a little faster shutter speed, but I can switch back and forth nice and easily from there. So there are just a couple things to keep in mind. It's super handy to use the U1, U2, U3 to get to a starting point of settings. However, remember, switching into that position on the mode dial sets it back to the starting settings. It doesn't remember what you were before if you moved away. So for example, if I'm photographing a waterfall and I've slowed the shutter speed down slower than 1/25th, say I'm at 1 second for a waterfall, and I decide I'm going to go photograph handheld, I take my camera off the tripod, I go over, I switch over to U2, get my handheld settings, have great success, have a great time. I decide I want a couple more shots of the waterfall. When I come back to the waterfall, put my camera back on the tripod and choose the U3 setting, my preferred tripod setting, it's going to go back to the starting settings. So it's going to have all my settings as they were, as I liked them to start. So that shutter speed is not going to be 1 second anymore. It's going to be back to the 1/25th. So something to keep in mind. It's not memorizing your settings while you're in that button. It's setting it back to your default starting settings. So if you switch modes, you will need to reset if you've made some adjustments from your default starting settings. So another nuance to be aware of is what happens if you turn your camera off and back on. When you turn your camera off and you come back into your U1 or U2 setting, the camera loads your custom starting points. So for example, if you're in U2 for your handheld mode, and so you get your ISO set to 400, you're photographing, gets a little darker, so you change that ISO to say ISO 800 so you can keep nice and stable while you're doing your photography. Things are working great, and you decide, I'm going to hike down the trail 10 minutes, and when you do that little hike, you turn the camera off, and when you get there, when the camera comes back on, it's going to load your custom starting point. So that means you're going to be back at ISO 400 instead of the ISO 800 that you adjusted it to. It's really not a big deal, but it's something to be aware of if you're turning your camera off and on between areas. So I hope this helps. Using those custom settings can really help you change from situation to situation, especially when you're out there going from tripod to handheld and back to tripod. There's always those little settings. The exposure triangle, not so hard to adjust and change. You probably sort of know where you want to be. But there's things like exposure delay and things like vibration reduction. I'm always forgetting to turn those off. It's like I go handheld, press a button, nothing, because I forgot to disable exposure delay. It's still set to my default 2 seconds. So super handy to let you go back and forth like that. And it just makes things more convenient, even if you're only going to be photographing with a tripod. You can just sort of set your camera up and you'll be right where you sort of want your starting point to be, and you'll be able to work from there. Super handy. Do you already use the custom settings on your mode dial? If so, what handy defaults have you found that work well for you? Let me know down in the comments. And if you liked today's video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any landscape photography content from me in the future. And thank you for watching.